Hello, so this might be a slightly longer video because there are a number of things that I want to address. Hopefully the sound will be passable, let's say, passable. Um, I want to address the flags controversy that is going on in the United States. Well, not just flags, actually, I should say, Confederate memorials controversy. Um, this isn't entirely new, but it's obviously been, the controversy has obviously escalated this year with the sort of social unrest and clashes that we've been seeing, especially around Charlottesville. Now, I think it's very important to make a few disclaimers before I begin this, just to get it out there so that no one gets the wrong idea about me. I have no sympathy with any sort of white supremacist movement or any white supremacist ideology. That's not what I'm about, that's not what I associate with, and it's not what I want to be perceived as associating with in any sense of the word. But I do think that there are real political overtones to what we are seeing happening here. And some might say, well, you're British, why do you care what's happening in the United States? There's a few reasons for that. Firstly, I think that there is a real possibility of serious social unrest in the coming years. We've already seen a lot of this. It seems like every week there is another clash, either at a university campus or somewhere, between the alt left and the alt right, for want of a better term. These ideological clashes, I'm not going to get into who starts each and every one of them. I don't think it's as simple as one side is perfectly good and the other side is perfectly bad. I think there are troublemakers on both sides, and I do believe that there is people who are not exactly helping matters on both sides. Um, but this is resonating on a bigger scale because, firstly, the United States is the most powerful country in the world. It's a country that sees itself as the leading nation of the free world. So inevitably outsiders are going to take an interest in the social situation that is going on there. But this is having, I don't know if it's a trigger effect, if it's resonating in other parts of the world, because now in Britain, similar questions are arising about some of our statues. Not long ago, Nelson's Column, a famous landmark in London, honouring Admiral Lord Nelson, one of our great military heroes, the naval hero of the Battle of Trafalgar, and one of our greatest military leaders ever. There's now controversies over his links to the slave trade. So what I want to do is look at this video or break down this video into several segments. I want to talk about legacy around the American Civil War, in particular the Confederate side of things. I am very interested in the American Civil War. I have been for most of my life, actually, going way back to the mid 1990s when I was just a child. A distant relation of mine was one of the heroes of Gettysburg, Lieutenant Charles E. Hazlett. He was a Union commander at Little Round Top. He was killed before Chamberlain took over, for any history aficionados. Um, I've been to some of those battlefields, particularly around the Gettysburg campaign, and so I find myself being very moved with anything to do with the Civil War in a way that no other conflict except the World Wars perhaps moves me, because I feel, being Northern Irish, there's a resonance there somehow from Ulster American links and so on. Can't really explain it, but I do find myself getting very moved by when I think of the Civil War, when I think of the implications of it, when I think of the impact that that had on the American psyche. The award-winning 1990 Ken Burns directed documentary, really is one of the greatest documentaries ever made. It was award-winning, exhaustive research, interviews, archival photo reels, etc. Um, they had testimony in that from the historian Shelby Foote, who was a Southerner. But I feel his assessment came across as very fair and measured. He was a Southerner, so he certainly saw certain things from a Southern perspective. but I think he was also fair in his assessment of the Union side of things. Now, what I don't want to do in this video is give a history lesson, like the American Civil War began because of A, B, and C, but I would paraphrase Shelby Foote. In an interview, presumably not too long before he died in 2005, he said that it was a great sadness for him that the Confederate flag is now primarily associated with racism and the Ku Klux Klan. And this is not entirely the whole story, because primarily the Confederate flag was about the Confederacy as a confederation of secessionist states. And it was later adopted, of course, by the Ku Klux Klan. So it's very easy to see where the racist connotations lie, and that is understandable because the Klan used it, and many genuine racists in the South do endorse the Confederate flag. But I really think one of the problems that we're seeing today in these current protests is a complete laziness on the part of people who want to dismiss the Civil War as black and white, as completely right and wrong, and it really is not that simple. It really isn't. What Shelby Foote said was that people who say the war had nothing to do with slavery are absolutely wrong, but those who say that it was only about slavery are equally wrong. Sometimes it's forgotten that there was almost as much animosity towards African Americans in the North as there was in the South, and the average Union soldier wasn't motivated by a moral crusade to defend slaves. Probably most of them were motivated to preserve the Union or because they were conscripted, certainly in the case of Irish immigrants. Um, and likewise with the South, most Confederate troops, I doubt, were motivated by racist ideology and we're fighting because we want to keep down the slaves. It was about the Southern mentality of their concept of being betrayed by the Union, as the monologue in the film Gettysburg shows. And I don't want to rely too much as it is a great film, because obviously there's artistic license in films, but um, there's some great monologue during the camp scene. General James Longstreet says we should have freed the slaves, then fired in Fort Sumter. I believe that one of the biggest mistakes the Confederacy made was allowing themselves to be associated with the evil and abominable practice of human slavery. By associating themselves with that, or at least not distancing themselves from it, they then allowed that to be the defining issue. And it couldn't have been separated from the Civil War, not when millions of human beings were held in servitude in the middle of the 19th century, at a time when scientific and technological progress was advancing rapidly. Um, but take, for example, someone like Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is a good example of the very complex nature of a lot of the individuals in the Civil War era. Now, it's not entirely true that Robert E. Lee was entirely against slavery, and there is certainly an ambiguous reading into what his first-hand accounts state his own philosophy. I would say Robert E. Lee's mentality on the matter was not that different from most prominent white men of the 19th century, North or South, British, French, American. Um, this was the prevailing dominant mindset of the 19th century, that white civilization was helping the black man by bringing him into the civilized world. And Robert E. Lee's letter, dated, I believe it was 1856, stated that he personally didn't like slavery, but he felt it would be a gradual process of elimination rather than, and he felt that they were better off in the United States than in Africa. Now, of course, by today's standards, and rightly, we deem that to be absolutely shocking. In that sense, absolutely, Robert E. Lee had racist views. But I think it's misguided to simply dismiss him as being one and the same as someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest. the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, or one of the founders. Robert E. Lee worked very hard for reconciliation after the war. He did free his own slaves, and another Confederate general, James Longstreet, who incidentally is not that widely hailed in the South, actually led a regiment of black troops during the insurrection in New Orleans in, I forget the specific name of that event, but I believe it was the Battle of Liberty Place, 1884. James Longstreet, former Confederate general, led a unit of black troops. Um, so I have a problem with simply dismissing every single Confederate as a hardcore racist in the modern sense of the word. Certainly, there was racism there in what, in terms of what we would regard racism today. Now, I'm not saying that, oh, we just have to understand the times and contexts, etc., etc., because there were abolitionists who were ahead of their time and saw slavery for the evil that it was. So I'm not for a second saying that the time itself is an excuse for some of those views. Nevertheless, I do think it's important to put it into context. Um, so Robert E. Lee's own stance on slavery was somewhat ambiguous and complex. He neither approved of it, but nor did he do much to stop it. That's my reading of Robert E. Lee's views on slavery. Um, but in terms of the regular Confederate troop, I mean, the regular Confederate soldiers, most of these were poor farm boys who were too poor to own shoes, never mind slaves. I also feel, frankly, a bit uncomfortable with desecrating war memorials of any kind on the grounds that when you look at national battlefields like Gettysburg, and I've been there, I wonder where this is going to go. At the moment, they're bringing down statues. Now, at what point are they going to start vandalizing Confederate graves? And to me, that would be repugnant. Whatever you think of the Confederate rationale for the war, and my own sympathies, I have to say, lie more with the Union, much more with the Union. But whatever you think of the Confederates, those regular soldiers had immense courage. I mean, if you look at what they done at Pickett's Charge, to march almost a mile in open ground, facing cannon, facing rifles, the courage of the ordinary troops was profound. And these men, like I say, were not fighting because they hated black men. They were fighting because of their sense of the Southern rights. And because they were called up, and I suspect on both sides there was pressure. There were, of course, Southern Unionists who faced a great deal of hostility. Um, so I think the American Civil War is very complex. I don't think it's particularly helpful to say one side was benevolent and the other side was evil. I think that's just, and you could say that pretty much about any war. World War One, not every single German troop was an evil pawn of the Kaiser. You know, World War Two, even not every single German troop was a Nazi stormtrooper. So when we're talking about war, we have to be very careful not to be overly simplistic. I think that's very important. And that's not the same as making excuses for anything, it's simply stating the obvious, which is that an event as profound as the American Civil War wasn't straightforward. It really wasn't. Some have also said that the charge of treason is unfair because there was other acts of secession even before the Civil War. West Virginia broke away from Virginia. There was the New York draft riots in 1863, where there was a real chance of anarchy in New York City. There was huge opposition to the war in the North. It's sometimes easy to forget that Abraham Lincoln, today he's rightly seen as a great president, but in the midst of his term, he was widely hated, despised even, seen as a tyrant. And in that sense, he's a tragic figure because his greatness was only really assessed afterwards. I really think that this current debate is being motivated more for political reasons than genuine sort of moral reasons that the statues represent the lost cause. Certainly, I would suggest that those statues, when they were put up, probably were put up by shady organizations. There were organizations that had links to the Ku Klux Klan that funded these projects. It's not my place to say whether the statues should stay up or come down. I certainly think if they do come down, it should be done in an ordered way, removed by city authorities rather than far left mobs wearing balaclavas. So if they must come down, if that debate is had and it's deemed that they should come down, it should be done in an ordered way. But I do feel uneasy that this could go in a direction where graves of ordinary Confederate troops are then desecrated, and that applies all over the world really. I mean, certainly, if you look at parts of the world, there are figures who are still held up in terms of granite and bronze that are celebrated that were mass murderers. I mean, there's statues of Chairman Mao all over China. There were statues of Stalin in Eastern Europe. Many of them were pulled down. Um, so statues are inevitably very political in nature. But you have to wonder, why is this all coming about now at this particular time? I'm not saying the statue should stay up or come down. I don't think that's my place. But as someone who's interested in history, I do think that a lot of those people protesting really haven't spent a great deal of time looking at the history of it. Their logic is all the Confederates were evil racists and that's it. Full stop. And I really have a problem with that oversimplification of history. Um, Also, pulling down the statue, what does it actually achieve in terms of building bridges? Where there are divisions in America today, I'm not convinced that pulling down statues is going to help anyone. And this is getting to the point of being ridiculous. I heard that a man who had the name Robert Lee was not allowed to comment on ESPN at a sporting event. I believe it was a baseball match or something. That's crazy. That is really, that's crazy. America seems like a deeply polarized society today. I believe Trump's partly responsible for it because I do think he rabble roused during his campaign. But the behavior of the alt left these days really needs to be scrutinized a lot more. And the problem is when you get organizations like CNN, which are simply not accountable, they will simply not report the behavior of far left thugs who cover their face, go out to vandalize property, and I've seen videos where mobs of left wing thugs are surrounding unarmed people, beating them to a pulp for no other reason than they might be wearing a Donald Trump cap. This is really concerning. And again, I'm an outsider, but I do see some of this start resonating in Britain. Obviously, not exactly the same issues. Obviously, it's not about Make America Great Again, but around all the Brexit issues, around Scottish nationalism, etc., we are also seeing some very polarizing situations in this country. I am not convinced that pulling down statues is the best way forward. I think there should be a debate. I think that's valid. And I certainly think that there should be an honest assessment of historical figures like Robert E. Lee. But you have to wonder, why has this all come about in the past few months? Charlottesville was certainly a trigger, but I think it began before that. And I believe that there is ideological far left people who are motivated not only from this is the ironic thing. These people are against the Confederate flag, but they're actually against the American flag as well. When I see protesters wearing the American flag upside down, I feel really I'm not even American, and that irritates me. How can you call someone a Nazi because they're holding an American flag? That's crazy. And this is the mindset of the alt left. Anyone who supports Donald Trump in any way, anyone who, and we're not talking here about white supremacists being targeted. I have no sympathy with white supremacists, but I'm talking about just regular people whose only apparent crime is to be patriotic and even wave the flag. And we have a similar situation in the UK. Anyone who expresses an affinity for this country, there are regressive leftists out there who automatically associate that with racism. Now, there's a lot more things that can be said about this. I'm going to leave it there. Incidentally, I'm going to see the film Detroit tonight in the cinema, which is not entirely unconnected. It's about, of course, the Detroit race riot 50 years ago this year. It's 25 years this year since the Los Angeles riots. Now, since then, there hasn't been anything quite on that scale. But I am concerned that it's only a matter of time before things really get to a head and boil out of control. For the record, I don't believe there's going to be another American Civil War. I don't think the conditions are right. There isn't standing armies. I don't think it's going to be like that. Nevertheless, it's a very tense situation there, and it's a collective responsibility of all those in charge. Yes, Donald Trump, but also the media and CNN's institutional bias is not helping matters at all. It really isn't. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know your thoughts. If you think the Confederate statue should be removed, I understand that. I do understand where you're coming from, but I think it should be done in an ordered way, at least. Or there should be a debate around it rather than just these random acts of vandalism. Let me know your thoughts.